Hi, this is Eyisegun once again, and this morning I just want to say something, or this afternoon rather, I just want to say something very brief about tithing. I know we're familiar with Malachi 3:10 that says, "Bring the whole tithe into the house, that there may be meat," or "Bring the whole tithe, that there may be meat in the house, and prove me therewith, if I won't open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing." There's a lot of controversy and debate about this tithing thing. Is it old school? Is it new school in terms of the testaments? Is it net? Is it gross, before or after tax? That sort of thing. And all of that. But I don't want to get into that this morning. What I really want to talk about is the whole tithe, the storehouse, and meat, because that's what it talks about in Malachi 3. Now, first things first, I need to say this, that when God said in, I think, Malachi 3:9 that we rob God, God was not talking to the tithe givers. He was talking to the priests who were misappropriating the tithe, in the same way that the sons of Eli the prophet were abusing the tithe. The second thing is when he says bring the whole tithe, he means everything, the whole tithe that is given to the priests. So the priests were pilfering the tithes, they were misappropriating the whole tithes. So it's not that they were not bringing something, but they were not bringing the whole tithe as it had been given to them. The third thing is the Bible talks about meat in my house, or food in my house. What does that mean? Why doesn't it say bring the whole tithe so that my kingdom can be expanded, and the gospel can be preached, and more people can be converted, and all those things? And I say this because in our current churches, when we talk about tithes and we receive tithes, and when we're asking for tithes, we say we're going to use it to expand the kingdom. And what does that mean? We buy buildings, or we build buildings. Our pastors go on conferences. We pay for their travel and their hotels, sometimes in 5 or 6 star hotels. We pay for conferences, and we pay for guest ministers who come over, and if they who get paid, a large sum of money, and in some cases we have to hire a nice car, put them up in the best hotels, and the pastor and the preacher is not going to come on his own. He's also going to come with his entourage, the wife, and God knows whoever's coming with him. And so all that gets paid for. We buy equipment in the church, and we paint the church, and we decorate it, and all of those things. And of course, the pastor gets a big salary, and all of that sort of stuff goes on. And all of this, and the pastor flies around the world, speaking in different churches, preaching the gospel. Now, this doesn't include taking the gospel to places where the gospel has never been heard before. It's just conference hopping. That's what I call it. And so this is the work of the kingdom, by our definition, in modern day Pentecostal, in the modern day Pentecostal church experience. But is that really what the tithe is for? If you study the word storehouse, that automatically tells you that we're looking at something where things are kept. And then it says, so that there may be meat in my house. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be meat in my house. So what is God saying? Okay, let me demonstrate to you what God is saying, and then I'll explain it. If you study the life of Joseph, we know the story of Joseph. Joseph went to prison, and he was released because of the dream. He was able to interpret the dream, and in the dream there was going to be 7 fat years, 7 years of plenty, and there would be 7 lean years. And what did Joseph do? He took all the grain that was harvested, in the fat years, and he stored them. They built storehouses where they kept them. And the grain consisted of things that were non-perishable, things that would last, could be stored over a long period of time. So we weren't talking vegetables here. We're talking corn, maize, and all those sort of things, proper grain, stuff that could be stored for extended periods of time. And the essence of all of this was so that the children of God would be preserved in the day of famine. God didn't just say, you know what, there's going to be a famine and that's it, everybody on your own, to thy tent, O Israel, pray to me. No, 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 no. He was shrewd and pragmatic in his approach. So he says, listen, he gave Joseph wisdom. Store up this grain, store up food, because there's going to be a famine. And when the famine came, it wasn't just Egypt that was affected, but the whole of the world, because Israel came along as well to seek food through Joseph's brothers. And so that's what the storehouse is for, to store grain so that in the day of crisis, God's people will not lack. In your church and my church, how much of the tithe is in the storehouse? If there was a crisis in your church or my church, and every man in the church was out of work, or the entire family that made up the church, the entire family or families, mother and father, were out of work because there's an economic crisis or collapse of some sort, would there be anything in the storehouse by which our lives would be sustained until something else happens? Because we need to remember that when Joseph stored the grain, they were sustained for the length of time of the famine. In other words, they didn't run out before. It wasn't a temporary situation. It kept them for the whole period that there was a famine. And so when we're storing up these tithes and there's a crisis, it should keep you for the whole period of your crisis until something else happens. That's what it is. But I don't think many of us can boast of that in our churches. I don't think that the whole tithe is kept, and I don't think that the whole tithe is administered in this way. But let me break it down. If I was a pastor, personally, I would make sure that the whole tithe is kept. Everybody would have a tithing record, and if you were to have a personal crisis that you needed money, you could draw from it. If there was a collective crisis in the church or corporate crisis, and people had stored and recorded, they could draw money. But let's just say that, you know, I really didn't like that, or I wasn't 100% with that. What would I do? So everybody gets a tithe card. So you record what you give us every month, or every year, every month. I think that's how people do it anyway, every month. For argument's sake, I take 10% for the church, paying for the building and the bills and all that stuff. And then, for argument's sake, I'll take another 20%, so that if we have projects that involve, you know, feeding the hungry, or buying clothes for those who are naked, or giving stuff to feeding the looking after the widows and that sort of stuff, I'd take 20% for that, and then the remainder 70 will accrue to the account of the giver. It doesn't matter if it's accruing for a year, 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years. It's going to stay there. Should they ever present themselves because there's a crisis, they will be able to draw from that. Now, it's not just about the money, because God says you rob God. Now, was God eating grain? Does God spend money? So why does God say we rob him? And this is what it is. When people are going through a crisis and they don't even know that there's a storehouse for them to go and get something from, and because there is nothing to cover them in the period of famine, they go through trauma that not only affects the individual, but if they have a family, affects their family. It affects their perception of God as a God of love, a God who cares, and a God who provides. Now, God is not a reactionary God. After the event, he starts looking for a solution. No. Because if we look at Genesis, the first thing God did in creation, he created everything that man needed on earth. And then he put the man on it. Even down to where Adam was working in the garden, God had made the garden, and then he put Adam in it. The animals from which we eat, and the vegetables and all of that stuff from which we derive food and sustenance, all those things were created before Adam came along. So God is a God who does things and prepares ahead of time, which is what he did with Joseph. So if we're going through a crisis and we cannot approach our churches, or our churches say we don't have money for this, or our churches say we're collecting all of this money to do all of these other things that have nothing to do with storing what you give, so that if there's a corporate or individual crisis, they can meet you, then they are abusing the tithe. And what that does is it alters your perception of God. If you don't perceive that a person loves you truly and can look after you, two things will happen. You either draw away from the person completely, or partially, in the sense that you acknowledge them, but you don't follow them fully. I'm a Christian, but in this area I need to go and sort myself out because God's not going to come through for me. I need to go and sleep with somebody to get some money to pay my rent because the church won't give me no money. I need to go and look for one man in the village to do some witchcraft for me so I can be rich, because if I'm in a crisis I can't go to the storehouse. And so God is robbed of the affections of his people, and he's robbed of fellowship with his people, proper fellowship with his people. He's robbed of honest relationship with his people, and he's robbed of a proper perception. And so God is robbed, it's not the money. He's robbed of his fellowship with you and with I. Once we begin to shrink back from God, we can go to church and still be distant from God. We can go to church and say, yeah, but I know that in this area I've got to go and sort myself out because I don't trust God. Why? Because when we misappropriate the tithe and we don't use it for what it's put together for, or collected for, then people's perception of God will change. And it's because they have suffered. If you have a very rich father, and one day, for some reason your fees haven't been paid or something happens, and your father has all this money, and you go through all of this crisis, and your father does not give you one penny, it will be very, very difficult for you to see him as a loving father. It will be very difficult for you to relate to him as a loving father. He will still be your father, you'll respect him and everything, but there will still be a distance. And your father will be robbed of the pleasure of proper fellowship. Now, this is a man who actually knows you're suffering and has chosen not to help you. Do you see what I'm saying? But God is not like that. He's not man. He's not man at all. He's not wicked. Because some people can be very wicked to their children. I know that God can be harsh sometimes. He can be tough. He can give you tough love sometimes. Yes. But at the same time, even when Adam and Eve sinned, God did not allow them to leave the garden naked. That's the nature of God. And so what we do when we misappropriate the tithe is we distort the nature of God and the perception of the nature of God in the minds of the people. And that's why it's so important that we really understand what this tithe is all about. It's not about the money. It's about the care of God and our perception of God as a God who loves us. I'm not going to say more than that, but I hope that I've given you something to think about. This is what I do. If you're somebody who's prone to giving and you feel the need to give, what would I do? I'd rather look for somebody who's suffering and give my money to them. That's what I would do, but that's just me. But let's put me aside and let's just look at scripture. God wants us to give. I don't have a problem with that. But if we're going to go down this Old Testament route of giving tithes and all of that stuff, then it's got to be done properly. The money should go to where it's supposed to go. It should be in the storehouse. It shouldn't be spent on anything. It should be stored. Joseph did not use, imagine the king in Joseph's day, the Pharaoh, when Joseph was storing the grain. He didn't say, give me the grain, I want to extend my empire. I want to build new cities. I want to fortify my army. I want to buy new weapons, and I want to go on, on wars to conquer new lands. He didn't do any of those things. Can you imagine if the Pharaoh had done all of those things and taken the tithe and everything, and Joseph had said, yeah, go for it, and then there was a famine? What would have happened to the people? They would have perished.